My job today is to pick up from the work that Steve is doing, and someone once described following Steve as just the worst possible place on a program, and I'm following Steve and I'm standing between you and morning tea, so I think I'm in the doubly worst place to be. But before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Whadjuk Noongar people, both past, present, and our focus today, obviously, on the future young elders who will lead this work. And it's particularly consistent with what I'd like to talk about, which is the lived experience of poverty as one form of vulnerability that we have with children. And I take this focus because often as adults we're put into positions because of our jobs where we're asked to make judgments and design interventions and collect information from young people. And part of our decision making is often based on our experience and by talking to lots of other old people about the sorts of things that we should be doing, or maybe moderately old people. And I'd like to argue today that there's so much that we can learn by making sure that we have student voice in everything that we do, that young people need to be co-researchers, they need to be co-designers, they need to be co-deliverers of what we do. Because if we miss their lived experience, then we're missing what's most important in terms of what we do to make change. So today, my presentation carries on from Steve's, so I'm examining one issue of vulnerability, obviously related to poverty. But first I'd like to spend maybe 4 or so slides just talking about if we just relied on data that's collected through surveys and other research that's done where we ask young people to tell us information perhaps through surveys and we use population level data. What do we know about the impact of poverty on children's education, for example, on their physical health, on their brain development, on their connection with friends and family? What does that evidence tell us? And then I'd like to spend the greater part of my presentation talking about what have we heard when we talk to young people. And in saying this, I'd like to acknowledge what the Commissioner's Office has done, and you'll notice that in almost every document that I've seen, certainly since Colin has taken the helm, there's been young person's voice within it, and I congratulate the Office on the effort to make sure that we hear from young people. Now, it's always a challenge, and I think I've been doing research for a long time and working in disadvantaged communities. I worked in Harlem, for example, for 5 years, from 1988 to 93. And during that time, Harlem wasn't a very nice place to be, and I have to tell you, being a blonde in that environment was not a good look until I opened my mouth, in which time the children heard my Australian accent, and thank goodness for Paul Hogan. Never met the man, but I thank him dearly, because that was around the time of Crocodile Dundee, and after the children asked me where I kept my knife, they truly allowed me in, and I probably didn't deserve that, but it was such an amazing experience to spend time. I spent most of my time in a place-based delivery system, and the place was called PS 246. You have to just worry about the soullessness of a place that had a number, not a name. It was a school, primary school, number 246. So that represented the challenge that we had in that community. It was seen as a place, but a place that the government set up, and a place that had government employees that were put in there that wasn't embedding itself and trying to understand what the community's needs were. And we struggled a lot because we weren't listening, and this was a community that was under siege. At that time, Harlem was much worse than the situation is now, and not better now because the government's really improved what goes on in New York State. The people who lived in Harlem have just been pushed further out into areas further away from New York, so it still represents a challenge. So it was almost a relief, to come back to Australia and apply all the things that we did wrong and the things, maybe some of the things that we did right, to some of the work that we've been doing since then. But I also am in a position here, as I start to talk about this research, that many of you would know that the amount of time that it takes from research to get from the bench, so if you think of sort of the basic research that we might do, to the bedside, on average, takes 17 years. Now, I hope that just fills you with dread. Discovery to getting into policy and practice is too long. I'm really fortunate, and as is Steve, that we work at the Telethon Kids Institute and we have partnerships with people like Colin, so that research like the amazing research that Steve has been leading gets into the hands of policymakers within 5 years or fewer. So we obviously are working really hard to make sure that we can do that. So when we think about poverty, just setting the scene, and Colin has already mentioned that about 17% of young people are identified as living poor, as determined by the Australian government. And you would have also heard Colin say, I know not with cynicism, because I've never heard you being cynical, Colin, but we know this is significantly lower than is the case. But if you just look at those numbers, it's close to 1 million children in Australia. This is not an issue that we can look past. This is an issue that we must be focusing on, and that we must deeply understand why what we should be doing and how we should be doing it, and particularly to those children that we're not reaching. So when Steve and I do research, we report that we've seen a mean change. So across, that doesn't mean mean as in angry, mean as in the average change. So we go into a population, we deliver an intervention, and hopefully we see an increase or a decrease if we're looking at problem behaviours. But what we don't see is who that intervention doesn't reach. So we say for a bunch of children, it was effective. There's a whole bunch of children that it wasn't effective for. So our research needs to focus on what research is working for which children, and for those children that it's not working for, what else do we need to be doing? So we need to be very tailored in our approach and the delivery systems that we provide. Now, the only way we can be tailored is by deeply understanding what the issues are. And you heard Steve talk about the importance of being selective and understanding the population to be able to make the right delivery, and particularly around issues like health, obviously, development and educational success. So looking at how does poverty influence a child's development, and we can't look past, obviously, the impact on their educational outcomes. And if you look at the learning and development gap that we have between poor children and their more advantaged peers, as you saw with Steve, the working poor, 6 months developmentally behind, and they stay that way. And in fact, if we just keep delivering resources in the same way that we always do, that difference can increase over time, that we need universal proportionalism. We need to make sure that everybody gets it, but the children who need it most get more of it and get it at the right time to be able to capitalise on that outcome. And as you can see here, the most socioeconomically disadvantaged areas in Australia are 4 times more likely to be developmentally vulnerable compared to those in disadvantaged areas. So how does it affect young people? It can affect their brain development, and particularly those of you who are familiar with the impact of having poor executive function being a key part of a child's development, and experiences of adversity obviously harm that part of the brain, or as the Centre on the Developing Child at Harvard University call it, the air traffic control system, the way that our brain controls all the planes coming into land and gets good systems occurring so there aren't too many crashes. So you can see the sorts of functions that this executive function provides for someone. And if they don't have those kinds of skills, obviously it disadvantages someone even more so. If I can't plan, I can't focus my attention on learning, for example, if I can't learn from my mistakes, the likelihood of my growth and development is obviously significantly impaired. In addition to that, and forgive my analogy here, it gets under the skin, and I mean that not in the sense of diseases per se, but you look at the impact of cortisol, that an adverse environment is obviously increasing the likelihood of cortisol being within our system, and high blood pressure and the impact on our immune system. There's now evidence to suggest that when we follow children longitudinally, that the impact of that cortisol and disrupted immune function leads to much earlier incidences of chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, cancer, diseases of the digestive system, and obviously mental health disorders as part of that process. So in addition to those physiological and educational effects, then we need to consider the impact on the family environment. What impact does this poverty or this hardship have? And as it says here, it's not the poverty so much that affects the relationship, but it's the impact, as Steve talked about, the working poor, the fact that they're so busy and perhaps exhausted and don't have the time perhaps to be able to spend with their children, and their children obviously need that responsive and consistent care in a very stimulating environment. I was fortunate enough to just finish a Churchill Fellowship that looked at the impact of technology use on children's development and learning And in our data that we're collecting very early stage, but in data that was collected in the United States, really serious implications of families engaging with technology at the expense of engaging with their children. So imagine a mother breastfeeding and the serve and return interaction that's so important to that fundamental neural development missing because over here it's my first chance to get on my phone. No judgment to families, but often families don't realise the impact of that. And sadly, we see that technology use is drawing away even the smallest amount of time that might have been left for children in all families across the spectrum. So this investment and the importance of us continuing to gently remind and support parents to deliver as much serve and return as they possibly can for their children is key. Which leads me to this challenge around how much do we listen to children? Now, again, I want you just to reflect on your own practice. If you're in this room, you care deeply about what we do to help children, and thanks very much for giving away your morning to do that. I want you to reflect on the work that you're doing and your past work, and I'm reflecting on this myself, so I'm not standing up here to say I've done it right. But on a scale from 1 to 10, I'd like you to make a judgment of your practices of your organisation in terms of how much they involve student voice in the work that it does. So if 10 is fabulous, you have young people that are very actively involved in policy development, the ways that your organisation is operating, through to 1 where maybe it's just tokenistic, if you may be using young people to speak your words, or maybe not involving young people at all. Roughly, where do you think your organisation would fit? I'm not going to ask anybody, so you don't have to worry about expressing it. But just decide, choose a number. Wherever maybe you're not working in an organisation like that, but you might reflect on the last organisation you're in. So maybe you gave your organisation a 6. I'm thinking of one of the organisations I work for, PS 246. I probably would have given that about a 3 in terms of its work. But I gave it a 3, which means there were things that I can acknowledge that it was doing. So whatever score you've given your organisation, just reflect for a moment, what are the things that they're doing to try to get student voice in the work that they're involved in? And as you reflect on that, can you think about ways that you might have been able to pull student voice up even louder or engage a greater range of young people so that you we'll never have a generalisable voice because it'll be too hard to get to every child, but a representative sample of voices. Now I want you to reflect on your number. I gave PS 246 a 4. Why didn't I give it a 5? Why didn't you give your organisation a higher score? Were there things that you were already thinking about that your organisation could have been doing to make sure that those young people's voices were listened to, or with a few more resources or a bit more time, or maybe engaging with volunteers to help you reach those voices, that might have made a difference in the longer term? Or maybe you're connecting with student voices or young people's voices. Student, if you're in a school, I know there's a number of school people in the audience, that you're connecting with young people's voices, but maybe not giving them enough of a voice in the activities that you have going on. So I guess pushing to the quote here by Ridge, which says, without a research agenda or about a practice that's open to understanding and acknowledging children's different perceptions and meanings, we risk overlooking or obscuring the very real and subjective experience of what it's like to be poor as a child. And this means we really need to go beyond the statistics to get a deep understanding of the complexities, and we can't make a change if we don't understand those complexities in their day-to-day experiences. And obviously this approach really values children. And I see Linda in the audience, and we miss you. I'm sorry to hear that you're no longer in your role, but Linda's work and her team's work focusing on valuing the child, all of us do it. I just mean the advocacy work that Linda was leading, the importance of us recognising the role that they can play as competent social actors who can give us that insight. I don't mean actors as in putting it on, I mean actors as in control of their destiny. So when we do talk to children, and when I say we, this is a collective we, my colleagues and researchers nationally and internationally, these are the kinds of information that are provided. The country that's doing this best, unfortunately, is not Australia, it's the UK. I think the UK have really focused on poverty and engaging young people's voices better than any that I've seen. And the sorts of themes that have come through that young people have talked about, and maybe compare this to the data that I've shown you and maybe other things that you've read in my early slides, to how young people feel about that economic security. And I wrote a word down here that was just a common theme, and that was they downplay their needs constantly. So if they're downplaying their needs and we're asking them what their needs are, it's likely we still won't be delivering. So giving them that chance to really speak about what their needs are. They downplay their needs socially because they don't want to ask their parents for money that they know isn't there. So they might seem like they don't want to engage in sporting activities, for example, but it might just be because they can't afford the uniform, the sorts of things that I know you all know so well. And of course, these other themes, none of them would surprise you, but constant themes when children are asked to talk about their lived experience of poverty, and those that Colin has already shown this morning in the videos that his office has collected. As is evident in almost every study, that children are acutely aware from a very young age of their family's struggle to meet basic needs. It's not something that they recognise at puberty, as well you would know, and as you can see here, the efforts to go easy on everything, particularly when money runs out at the end of the month, and the sorts of things that they might need to support them. This economic security, as you can see here, is also being deprived of those kind of basic necessities such as food and clothes, but also restrict a child's capacity to participate fully in the most important aspects of their childhood. Having holidays and toys and birthday celebrations and pocket money were the sorts of things that children regularly talked about as part of their overall experience. Now, the challenge that we often have, and here I am an old person talking about young people's voices, so I thought it would be really helpful to bring young people's voices, just like Colin has done, into my presentation. And this is Isha, and you'll hear Isha talking about the impact of poverty on her life experience in just a moment. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Isha Qasser Hakim and I am 10 years old. I like doing football and I like doing taekwondo, and what I would like to be when I grow up is a Prime Minister or a computer expert. I live in Glasgow and my area is Govan Hill. The good things about Govan Hill is that there's quite a lot of stuff that happens around and there's lots of parks and fun stuff to do. The bad things about Govan Hill is there's a lot of gangsters hanging around. They be nasty to people, bully people. I normally walk through Govan Hill Park when I either go to taekwondo or I go to school. And when I was going to school, the twins used to pass me and I would try and get away from them, but with them not seeing me, going another way to school. We might get into a fight or I might get battered down, and I don't like that. And now I just feel brave now that I'm going to taekwondo. I just feel brave that I just walk past them and don't look at them, or I wake up early in the morning so I don't see them at all. I don't have a bike and that's why I don't go out to play, because I've got nothing to do with a bike to play with, and my neighbours outside always play with them. First of all, they wouldn't let me play with them because they're boys, and I don't have a bike as well, so I feel lonely and left out and I can't play with that. People treat me differently because I'm poor and they tease me, and because I didn't have a DS, I didn't have a bike, I don't have a TV. There's a boy at me and says he's got 10 TVs. I don't believe that. He says he's got a millionaire. I don't believe that, otherwise he would be living in a posh house. People should respect people and treat people in poverty nicely, because you shouldn't make fun of them. In a child way of poverty, it is you feel different and you don't have the same things as your friends do. In an adult way, it means you've got no money to look after yourself, to buy yourself some food, some clothes. So that's why when I grow up and I become Prime Minister, I will help those people. I don't like poverty. I'm glad my mum goes to meetings and talks about it to people. I think she's a very good person who gets herself involved with things, and I'm very proud of her because she's spoken in front of 400 people. I'm going to grow up like that, so I think that's just teaching me the way I'm going to speak in front of the whole world when I'm a Prime Minister.
Thank you. Now, if you were listening to Asha, if she was someone in your care, what might be some of the things that you might tailor within her environment? If you had heard a number of Ashas speaking with that beautiful accent, what would you have picked up on? Is there something in her dialogue then that you would have thought, in the role that I'm in, that's something that I could make a difference with? Would anyone just care to give me an example of something that they picked up on, or some policy implication of Ash's comments then? Thank you. You're so brave. Can I have your name, please? Thanks, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you. It's only a small observation, but I noticed that there was a magic wand, and I thought, well, it's very easy to get a little stick and some sticky notes and ask a child what they'd like to wish for.
Yes, and obviously that can provide some really great insights at times. I mean, some things might not be able to be delivered like the Prime Ministership immediately, but not long afterwards. I thought it was interesting that the environment she lived in came up. You know, the gang having to get up earlier, for example, in the morning to go to as part of the intervention. Anybody else just dying to speak? I know that. Oh, thank you very much. Your name is, please? Vicky. Thanks, Vicky. Again, great courage.
Just on what you said there about the environment that she lived in, just the taekwondo and having the self-defence classes, I thought that's such an easy thing to kind of provide for children, just to get that empowerment to feel good about.
Exactly,
She can
the
walk
confidence.
past them now.
Yes, yes. She might not even be able to use it, but just the fact that it gave her some agency and confidence as part of that process, yes. So obviously there's lots of hints in what young people tell us of actions that they could take that would make a difference in the longer term. Can I thank both of the ladies who just spoke, who are so brave. So when we continue to listen to young people like Asha and hear the sorts of things that they talk about, the impact on their emotional and psychological well-being becomes evident, and you could hear a little bit of that in Asha's work, and it can obviously have serious long-term psychological effects, feelings of worthlessness or failure. Asha had someone in her life, her mother, obviously, who was trying really hard and was a great role model. Lots of children, as we know, like ones that we listened to this morning, don't necessarily have that level of support. But the issue of stigma, and you heard Asha talk about this as well, you know, people shouldn't pick on people for being poor, and the labelling. Young people in some of the work that we've been doing talk about even to have money doesn't mean that I lose that stigma. Children still think of me as poor. So we need to think about the ways that we engage with young people to make sure that we aren't increasing that labelling. Are we asking them to come and talk to us because we think they're poor? How are we engaging them that's respectful and doesn't lead to those longer term impacts? When we look at their friendship and leisure and social participation, in one of our studies I had a young person who said children are the most photographed and the least listened to of our population. And when we think about the ways that they engage in their leisure activities, and whether it be with technology, photographing themselves, or the efforts that they make to try and fit in. And Asha again made this comment about being excluded in her spiel that you heard there this morning, as we did with other young people. And the comment at the bottom here that even at preschool, children can have cognitive capacity to be aware of the social stereotypes about poor people that are around them and view them as a stigmatised group. So whatever interventions we put in place, we need to be so cautious that we're not adding to that level of stigma that children might be experiencing. Similarly, as we've talked about, they often miss out on lots of social opportunities, and young people talked about this a lot because they can't afford to participate or don't have the transport to be able to get there, and avoid admitting that they can't do things because of the cost in the longer term. And when we think about their schooling and their aspirations for the future, often young people talk about the opportunities they have in school and the environments that schools can provide. And I know I can see Aaron at the back of the room, and Aaron and his colleagues as principals in schools playing such an important role in providing environments for children to come to that can make a difference. There was some work that was done by Mara Brehanen out of the University of Quebec, and Mara works on a very large longitudinal study where children are followed over time to look at what are the predictors of success and otherwise. And one of the outcomes of her study, and one of the papers that she produced, she looked at children who came from difficult homes that were challenged, and went into good schools, not great schools, just good schools. What kind of a difference could that make to those children? And her research showed that good schools could compensate for many of the things that children were missing in their home environment. That's not just to say schools are the only settings that can do that, but evidence to show that a place with caring adults and other young people as pastoral carers as well, contributing and supporting young people who come from difficult circumstances can make a huge difference. We heard the young man Ryan, I think it was, who we listened to just a moment ago, talk about the 3 carers that made a difference in his home environment. The work that you're doing, no doubt, giving children support, comes through when they talk about what makes the most difference. So, by the way, Mara Brehanen's work also showed that when children came from reasonably good homes and went into terribly toxic school environments, the school environment harmed them as much as as a poor home environment. So it also shows how powerful our settings are in making a difference to help children and young people. So obviously their ability to participate fully is sometimes limited, as you can see, by whether they can afford the right equipment or uniforms and so on, but obviously provides an opportunity for them to have some hopes and dreams. I think I have time to show this. So this last section of Student Voice, just talking about what those hopes and dreams should be, and a perspective again from young people about what will make a difference. So as we look at all of these difficulties, what can be done to help and support young people through Student Voice? Thank you.
We are all young people from Mardown. We all have hopes and dreams for our future lives and careers. I want to be a global entrepreneur with a leisure centre franchise.
I want to be a childcare worker.
I want to be an Irish teacher.
I want to be a midwife and travel the world.
I want to be a famous singer and songwriter.
I want to be a chef, or an accountant, or maybe an undertaker. But if I could be anything, I'd be a poet.
But there is a problem. As soon as you get into secondary school, the teachers are like, you need a computer, you need a printer for doing your homework, and then you need the internet to do the research. And you're like, how am I going to afford that? Like, bills and food and stuff always come first. And if there is anything left over, which there never usually is, then you might be able to get a computer. So you save and save and save and just get close enough to buying what you need, then something comes up and you have to give your mummy all the money, and then you have to save up all over again. As you get older and you do your GCSEs, you have to work extra hard, stay late at school until like 7 or 8 to use the computers. You miss out on meals and end up going home late in the evening, walking through areas you feel unsafe in, just to get your homework done. And the teachers don't seem to understand. They just say it's on the internet, it's your own fault if you don't get it done. Your friends, they have all kinds of amazing phones, and you don't even have a phone. So when you make new friends, they say, oh, what's your number? And I'll text you. And you're like, do you want my mum's? How embarrassing is that, giving out your mum or your granny's number? Once you turn 16, you get your EMA, which means you don't have to ask your parents for pay everything for you. But the money soon goes on buses, books and food and wee things for your mum or dad, so it's so hard to save. When you do manage to buy a computer on your own, that's all fine, but then you have to pay for your internet, and it's very rare that you can just get internet. You have to get TV packages or a phone as well, and then you have to pay for it monthly. So you have to find places in town with free internet, but you can't go inside because you would have to buy something, so you hang around outside to try and get their free Wi-Fi. You got a computer, you found a way of getting internet, but you still get in trouble at school for not printing out your work. They still think you're not trying hard enough. It's not easy. But we still have our hopes and dreams about what we want to do when we grow up. And we have an idea that can help us get there. Imagine free computers, free Wi-Fi, free printers, somewhere we can all use in our own communities. No more late nights, detention, or messed up homework, just time to focus on our futures.
Imagine what we could do.
Thank you. So obviously when you saw that video, you saw lots of pictures and drawings of young people. Collecting information for young people can be challenging at times because some of them are not very verbal and they're not confident to speak. But using imagery, one study that we were associated with gave portable cameras back in the days when they were really popular to over 100 children and asked them to just take images of their community and then bring those back, and then we used the photographs to hear their views about what pictures they took of their community, why did they take those pictures, and then what do those pictures mean for them and what would they do about it. And this photographic journey was such a great way to draw information from young people, to get them to give us the sorts of information that might make a difference, because obviously this is not just about hearing how tough it is for them, but also hearing their voices around what should be done about it in the longer term. So schooling is a big part of the approaches, assuming children are in school age. Obviously children younger than that need to look at other settings that are supportive in the school environment. I know there are a number of people in the audience like Craig and others who are leading centres of parenting excellence and child and parenting centres that are designed to try and engage and support families from as young an age as possible. If you're associated with any of that work, obviously it's incredibly important for both the families and for the children alike. We also, through student voice here, as I've already reflected on, the extent to which children understand the difficulties that their parents are experiencing, both through their voice and obviously through data that we've seen, and the extent to which children are aware that their children are worrying about money and avoiding to ask their parents for money. And again, when we look at their communities and what they see within their communities and the pictures, for example, that they might have taken of their communities, we can see that there are often a lot of unsafe places to play. We saw in the last video there where children talked about how unsafe it was to walk back from school at the end of night and the implications that that can have for them engaging in activities that are around in their community. So when we focus on what do young people need to help them cope and actions that they might take, they come up with lots of recommendations, particularly around relatives and friends and the importance of engaging with other adults to support them, and the importance of good friendships. And we do a lot of work looking at bullying behaviours, and a lot of bullying is often targeted at children who are stigmatised and children who don't have what other children have. But when we think about actions that we can take to support young people, we often think about what can adults do and don't spend enough time looking at what can other young people do. Peers, as pastoral carers, are a key approach to actions that we take. In what ways can we engage young people to have the skills that they can support other young people as well as adults? So this is not instead of, this is just creating an even greater support structure that we can put in place. Those bystanders, upstanders, groups that can provide support and really help families to cope. So I need to close because I'm now standing between you and morning tea. My son, by the way, reminded me of something I once heard from him, and that was that my presentation should have a really good start and a really good finish, and they should come together as quickly as possible. So I'm at that point of wanting to end as quickly as possible. So when we think about what should we be doing, if we identify children who are experiencing adversity as a vulnerability, which obviously it is, what kinds of actions can we take? We need to understand their needs so that we can determine and tailor the responses that they need that are supportive. And at the same time, we need to understand and engage them not only in what should be done, but in being part of the solution, giving them the agency to be able to also contribute to those outcomes and designs in the longer term. And when we look and talk to policymakers, such as the opportunity that Colin has created for Steve and I and Alan this afternoon to be able to get in front of policymakers, because Colin can facilitate that much more easily than we can, we need to be encouraging policymakers to make sure that student voice is captured, and particularly student voice around poverty as part of the development of those policies. And if you can read what I've written in the bottom there in red, how children experience poverty in their everyday lives has important implications for the definitions, the measurements, the actions, everything we do that we hope will address poverty and improve outcomes for children. So future research directions. In Australia, we still have lots of work to do. As I said before, the UK is really leading the world in terms of their understanding of the lived experience. You would have seen the Poverty Commission was the sponsor of those 2 videos. They've got some amazing work. If you're interested in other supports, I've included that as one of the references at the end of my presentation. But in Australia, we know very little about children's experience of poverty, and in fact, through CoLab, which is an initiative led by the Telethon Kids Institute, we are using a place-based approach, as Steve talked about a while ago, with a very active engagement of government, which is key to make sure we see this policy change, and using that process to talk deeply with the community, with families, making sure that families are driving what it is that we will be delivering over a 10-year period with support from the Minderoo Foundation. Because we do have a very limited understanding of children's lived experience of poverty and how that intersects, most importantly, with other inequalities that they might be experiencing related to race or gender or disability as part of that process. So policymakers and practitioners need to initiate their own consultation as well, not just rely on researchers who feed it up because they might not believe us. As Steve said, sometimes they think we make it up just to try and influence them, but I promise, at least we don't, to get change in the longer term, and that those consultations have to be respectful and sensitive, as I talked about before, and include a range of methods and innovative ways to communicate findings, like using imagery. Every child pretty much these days has a phone, no matter how poor, that will collect photographs, and what a terrific way to get insight into young people's experiences, and they're very happy to do that. And that those children have the capacity and great willingness to be able to help and find solutions for themselves and for others, and that they really want to be listened to and supported. In one of our studies, one of the young people said, "This is the first time anyone's asked us what we should be doing around this," and this young person was 15 at the time. I promise every single slide that I showed you had a reference next to it, but it was so hard to read that I took them all out. So if you are particularly interested in one piece, I can find that for you in a reference, but these are broadly the ones that I've had, and I welcome you to join us in helping to make a difference. There are 2 evidence summaries that CoLab and Telethon Kids has recently released that you'll see on our website. One is called The Impact of Poverty on the Developing Child, and the other is The Lived Experience of Poverty Among Children, which I've given you a snapshot of today. Thanks very much, everyone.